Why did I want to be a writer? Well, I'll admit, I had some pretty romantic notions about writing starting out. Um, I remember I was actually here in the Seattle area, in Linwood, and I was staying at this hotel across from the Alderwood Mall, and there was a strip mall across the street from our hotel, and there was a Barnes and Noble, and I would go over there a lot with my notebook, and I would grab all the writing books off the shelf, and I would read them, and I would read the back of them, and it would be like, oh, so and so's a writer and essayist, and all this sort of thing, and I thought like, yeah, that's maybe for me. Um, and so I thought it would be, kind of like that sort of thing, and I had this kind of very romantic idea of what writing would be and could be and should be, um and that just kind of kept going in terms of I wanted to be that, I read every book about writing I could get my hands on. um I was a big fan of the library growing up. I grew up in a rather kind of sheltered environment, so the library was kind of like my escape. And so I just read a lot about writing and character and setting and all this type of thing. Bearing in mind, I had a lot of false starts. I didn't really understand story or plot. I didn't understand what made a story work. I didn't understand how to sort of create the arc of something, even within like a fairly simple genre, kind of like murder mystery, which is very structured. There's people there, somebody gets murdered, the murder must be solved. Um, I had a lot of false starts. Industry and business wise, I did not understand how the industry worked. I didn't understand how the world worked because I started my first tentative steps into writing when I was 17 years old. And so I wrote some things and put into some contests. I think I fell for every single writing scam on the block. I erroneously thought that, oh, my stuff is super good, like I'll win a contest or two or do something else, and I had gotten something published in an anthology of American students that my English tutor was doing with her kids, and uh, I thought it would be pretty easy and simple. I've been working with this English teacher for like 5 years, and most people don't know this. When I started out, I actually at 12 years old I couldn't put together, like I couldn't write out an English sentence that was like capitalized and punctuated and all this type of thing. Wasn't possible. Had to get a tutor for it. And and so I really struggled with all of that, and so not only did I kind of finally get to a place where I could like write and it kind of sounded okay, but then I didn't understand, like, oh no, you have to like write a lot and develop a voice and figure out how to tell a story and all this type of thing. So I just didn't have any clue. So it was a lot of struggle early on, and it was kind of discouraging, and I kind of walked away from it for a while. Um, and it took a while to come back to it. I did writing adjacent things. I ran my first magazine in 2009 when I was 21 years old. I wrote for my college newspaper. I worked at my college radio station. I did lots of kind of other media things. But I didn't start writing fiction seriously till 2013. Um, and even then, and it's been 10 years since then, it has been a whole journey and a lot of learning and a lot of writing conferences and a lot of getting advice from people and a lot of figuring things out on my own. I think that's one of the things that they don't tell you at the beginning. Why is writing your first book so damn hard? Writing is going to be hard no matter how you cut it. I'll just say that right now. Finishing any project to completion is a big lift. When I was finishing the Sweetgrass Saga, which was the last thing I finished, it was at the end of my MFA program. I got sick right after residency, and lost a week, had to complete the whole. I had to complete 50,000 words more than I'd already written in 3 weeks. So the whole project came in at 103,000 words. It took 5. I had to get an extension. um, and it involved writing 4 or 5 hours a day on top of everything else I do, which is the Cameron Journal and podcast interviews and all this type of thing. I didn't unpack from residency for a week. My dishes were sky high. I had enough pizza boxes that I think people were thinking I was running an illegal pizza shop out of my apartment. It was a huge lift. There's a lot to finishing a project. You have to tie up all the loose ends. You have to get all the characters to where they belong. You kind of have to wrap everything up in a nice and neat fashion. And that's just a huge lift. Even if you get through the struggle of starting and the pain of getting to the middle and getting to the end, just like getting to that final chapter where all the content is there is just absolutely gut-wrenching. I think even for genre people, and like romance or mystery or thriller, it's a lot. Coming up with 50, 60, 70, 80,000 words out of your brain and putting them on the page, be that a paper page or a digital page, is just a lot. There's no two ways to cut it. It's a lot. And there's just so many moving parts to it, and getting those words there, it can get really easy to bog down. It can be easy to give up. But once you have one done, the second one becomes easier. And I kind of cheated on my first one. My first book was my nonfiction book, What the Hell is Going On? A primer to our world in the age of Trump. And it was a compilation of very long essays that I had written for the Cameron Journal. And then I added in 2 new essays on education and racism. And that was the book I learned on this, where I learned a book layout and how to make a cover and how to sell it, and it was the training wheels. Like, I kind of cheated a little bit, but even getting that done, and keep bearing in mind the content was already written, gathering it all together, re-editing it, laying it out, learning all of that whole process was its own kind of crazy insanity. Nonfiction is less daunting. But you do have to put down everything that you want to say. You have to check out sources, quotes. The writing has to be tighter than fiction prose, I find, and it has to be deadly accurate if you take what you do seriously. And I do. So, I mean, that's all kind of part and parcel of how it's so hard to write your first book. I did find, having finished a nonfiction book and put it out to the world, it gave me a lot of confidence to finish my novel, which I had been working on since 2007, wasn't published till 2020. And it gave me confidence to finish my short story collection. And I released both of those in 2020. My timing could not have been worse. But it is a difficult thing. The end starts to become all consuming, and it's really hard, I think, to find the time to get there if you're not doing it full time, or you can't really block out the time to do it. But I mean, your mileage may vary. I'm sure there's probably some people that are kind of like, I don't know what he's talking about. It is easy peasy. I mean, I've overheard these people at writing conferences. So maybe I'm all wet, but for me, it's something like the end is the hardest part. I'm finishing a few projects right now, and some of them are so close, and I just know the only way to finish is to just like lock myself with the work for at least 4 to 5 hours a day and just plow forward. How do I handle writer's block? Well, I'm extremely blessed. I very rarely suffer from writer's block. True story. I always have something to say. Usually. Very rarely am I left speechless. If I'm having trouble with a project, it's usually because there's a problem. In terms of, I cannot conceive of where the story is going. I need to know kind of where I'm going in order to figure out how to get there. And so usually I find if I'm having trouble with a project, it means I need to go back through, fix the problems of the plot and the story, and then once I kind of make that breakthrough, then I'm home free. But I think it is good to get something out. Sometimes I just write out ideas, and that can lead to prose. Sometimes I engage with other things that kind of get the creative juices flowing, especially other fiction. But even movies and television sometimes can get me over the hump. I have a project right now that's quite huge. It's kind of a lifelong dream, um, and it's a complete fantasy world, and it's I've been working on it for a decade. I've been working on it since the earliest days of this phase of my writing career, and there's moments where I was just the other day looking at the outline and trying to understand, what's missing, what's not here, what am I not telling? And there's some gaps and things, and I haven't worked on it very much. And so I know that the problem with that project is I need to review what story we're telling, really, and whose story that we're telling. And it's complicated because it's a braided story. There's about four storylines that eventually collapse down into two. And that makes for, logistically speaking, some quite difficult things. But it also, you have to be very careful with how you plan that, because it's easy to drop a storyline, drop a character, all this type of thing. So if you're having writer's block, I would say, go back to the beginning. What story are you telling? What are you trying to say? And start on that basis. And I think you'll find the way to break through. What is my process? Ugh, this is a question I ask people all the time, and I hate getting asked. Um, I well, process in what way? I used to write longhand. I did that for a long time. I had a lot of. I'm a big fan of Moleskine notebooks. I have seven, and I think I have five or six in the archives. And I liked that. I used to be very bougie and sit in metronome coffee in Tacoma with my moleskin notebook writing away, with coffee or sometimes a glass of wine. And that got me to a point, but I found out if I wanted to write faster and in volume the way I do now, I needed to switch to an all digital process, which I did in 2018. It was a huge adjustment. I do miss writing longhand. I know somebody who writes longhand, does it on a typewriter, and then digitizes it, and then has kind of a finished work by the time he's done. I don't miss spending hours transcribing it all into a computer. That was incredibly tedious. I mean, it was great because I would be transcribing and I would write, and I would end up with, way more work than I had started with, but it was really tedious, and I don't have the time to do that anymore. As far as writing process goes, I'm a big fan of outlining. But I think I outline so I can have freedom to kind of work within the framework that I have set up. I'm a big fan of what I like to call doing storyboards, where you really pace out everything that happens in the scene, what a subplot, is, or what you want to do with things that you want to have happen, moments that you want to have occur. I think it can be really helpful to kind of get that out first, so that then once you have those ideas, you can then start writing those scenes, those moments, and connect them together. Sentences make paragraphs, paragraphs make pages, and paragraphs make chapters, and chapters make books. So, it's a very interesting thing. For nonfiction, I'm very big on research. I like to read and watch voraciously before I write about a topic in the nonfiction world. Fiction's harder that way. You sometimes have to research. Like, I write historical fiction a lot, and that involves a lot of research too. Because I'm very realistic with how I write. Um, I want to make you feel like you're there. I want to make you feel like things are accurate. And so there's a lot of research there too. With nonfiction, it's kind of double the effort, because it's like I need to understand this whole problem, who the leading experts are, what their thoughts on it are, what do I bring to the conversation, what am I trying to explain to people? Where do I think the problem is? Are there any solutions? Do I have any ideas on a solution? What policies have been tried? All this type of thing. Especially, I kind of work in like news and politics and public policy and all this type of thing. And so, it's so for me that process is research heavily, gather tons of stuff, read lots of books, and then once you kind of have all of that outline, figure out what you're going to say, and start saying it. I am faster writing nonfiction than I am writing fiction. And sometimes in the course of doing something, I will write about things on the Cameron Journal, so sometimes I can go back and pull that content in and reuse it on stuff, which is really helpful. I was just working on something the other day about employment policy and work-life balance and all this type of thing. And I was sitting there being like, I feel like I've written about this a lot. Let me go to my library on the Cameron Journal and see what I have. And I found 5 things, and I'm kind of like, oh, good. We'll start on this basis, and we'll go revisit those sources and see if there's new information and all this type of thing, and kind of go from there. So if you're writing nonfiction, look at what you've already written. And if you're writing fiction, I have to encourage you to outline, get those ideas out of your head. They don't do you any good in your brain. Why did I give up on traditional publishing? Well, I did until I didn't. So I'm working with a small press hybrid publisher right now. But I published my first 3 books myself. It was a hard decision for me to open up my own little press of one, Widgery Omni Media, because I really craved that industry validation, and I wasn't really getting it. I did kind of, this is kind of what's weird about the writing industry. There's very rarely will you work in an industry where you can get told no and you brag to others about the way in which they told you no. When I sent out my first novel to agents for review, I had 2 agents that requested a full manuscript within 1 day of reading my query, which is fast. I mean, if that usually signals they're interested, because you're not in the slush pile. And there was about a 12-hour period where I was like, what if they both want my book? What do I do then? I'm like, I'm gonna have to call my dad and like negotiate or something. They both ended up passing on it. But that was nice to, and I was really kind of devastated, but I talked to other writer friends, and they were kind of like, well, you don't live in the slush pile, and the story was compelling, and they wanted to read it and check it out, and so, I mean, so that that's why I say, like, the good rejection. This is the only industry where we have to talk about the good rejection. Maybe acting, I think, as I've also acted, is another thing with auditions and everything, but, like, the good rejection is a whole thing. I gave up on traditional publishing because I wasn't getting anywhere fast. And that's the thing with traditional publishing, is you don't get anywhere fast. You can end up writing a lot of projects that don't end up really ever getting anywhere. And I wanted to put something out because people liked my work when I read it at parties, when I talked about it in Ubers with people. People were rip-roaring ready to go. And so I decided I was going to go to the people. And that's one of I think, the great things about self-publishing now that's different than traditional publishing is we can go right to the people. We can go find those audiences. And maybe they're not big enough to make Random House or Simon & Schuster happy, but they're big enough to at least get you off the ground and begin to create that community around yourself and your work that's, going to make whatever you want to get from this sustainable. Everything with traditional publishing is a much, much longer drawn out process. From the moment an agent accepts your book, it can be months before a publisher accepts it when it's out on submission. It can then be a year and a half before it hits the shelves. Which means the whole process from the first word you write to it actually being on a shelf can be 5 years. Really. It can take that long, especially for a debut. In self-publishing, we can work a little faster. We can't write your book any faster, but we can get it out into the world a little bit faster and build an author platform and get people excited and advertise and all this type of thing. So, ironically, when I kind of left the traditional publishing world behind and pursued self publishing and making my books as professional as possible and all this type of thing, I got a publishing in a major journal. So that worked out. So kind of by the time I kind of gave up on the validation, I got some anyway. And then now I'm working with this great small press publisher, and we have a great relationship. So life can come full circle sometimes. Do I think I would have gotten any of those opportunities if I didn't have books out already? No. Am I glad that I have books out and already have my own audience? Yes. That put me, when working with a publisher, it put me in a different tier, and that was a good thing. It was worth it. But I mean, I will say self-publishing is many things, but it is not cheap. Um, there's the upfront costs of getting your book up and going, and then there's the costs of advertising it and getting it out there and building an author platform, which at least involves a website and some social media. There's costs in this for sure. And so people who talk about, oh, publishing for free and all this, yeah, you can do that if you want to publish a guide on how to do something on Gumroad or whatever have you, and that's great. But if you're trying to publish your fiction, there's going to be some costs involved. Fortunately, they're pretty manageable. In terms of if you can cobble together a few $100, you're good to go. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. So, like I said, I gave up on traditional publishing until I didn't, and then now we're here. So I don't have to do my own book layout anymore, which is kind of nice. Writing has taught me many things, but most importantly, writing is very healing. It's how I work things out. Um, Sometimes that gets published for public consumption, and sometimes it doesn't. Uh, Great writing has the power to give us empathy and put us into other people's shoes. And I don't care what kind of writing it is, exploring other lives and possibilities makes us better human beings. Being able to explore what someone else is going through, what matters to them, what they love, what they hate, um, what matters to them at a deep personal level, I think it opens your mind to experiences outside of your own. And that needn't necessarily be the classics, although I am a big fan of the classics and I think more people should read them. And I think, having people be educated in the cultural heritage of our civilization is a good thing. I also know that a lot of people learned a lot of things from much more popular selections, like a Harry Potter or an Aragon or even maybe 50 Shades of Grey, or Twilight. I think, even though those are not what I would maybe necessarily consider quality fiction as such, I know a lot of people learned a lot from them, and it can open up new conversations and create, newness. I think reading whatever it is you're reading is a good thing. Even if you consume, you know, every single manga you can get your hands on, you're reading, you're experiencing, you're exploring other worlds, you're spending time with yourself, and those are things that are very important. I think that's where you learn a lot about life. I was a voracious reader as a child. I just absolutely read books all the time. I wish I had the time to read as much now as I did then. Um, and I learned a great deal about historical events and people and things, everything from the Hundred Years' War to ancient Rome to the Holocaust. For me, words put a face, a literary face, on those historical events, and that made all the difference to me. And so I think that's what writing has taught me, is to kind of be a student of people, first and foremostly, which isn't my natural inclination. But it is, that's the power of writing, that's the power of story. What does writing mean to me now? Well, it means many things. It's a very deep part of who I am. It's also a world of possibility. I create these worlds, these fantasies, these whatever, and people read them, and I'm always surprised when people read my work and they come back and they tell me about their experience, and it's totally out of what I ever thought it would be, but it was very personal to them. Um, and that's what's exciting for me is those conversations. Most people would be shocked to hear I don't actually like writing the process that much. It's hard. It takes a long time. I can write a new song in an afternoon. A novel takes years, and I'm pretty fast. But it still takes at least 6 months. Even for genre of romance and mystery, it takes time. It's intense. It's time consuming. It's hard to write if your life is really crazy. This affects women a great deal. I was listening to a masterclass with Margaret Atwood, and she was talking about how she had to write around her children and now her grandchildren, and how you know is something where you can't necessarily always. Not everybody's in a position to devote themselves to it full time, um, with no other considerations, especially women who have all these obligations and unpaid labor and emotional labor and all this type of thing. It's a kind of a crazy thing, and I'll admit I struggle if my schedule is too crazy, and I don't have children. I have a business to run though, and if there's too much else going on, I struggle to write. If the schedule is too full, writing becomes really hard. So, and that's where people say, "Oh, you should write in the morning and before the day starts." That I'm so brain dead in the morning that does not work for me. But if I can sit down for 5 hours and get 2 words out, then I'm proud. I like to write at night, but it can be hard to get that brain power into play after a full day of podcasts, appearances, general life, all this type of thing. I think Fran Lebowitz has the best idea. Write 2 books, get famous, then write nothing at all for 30 years and just talk about stuff. That's great. Nice work if you can get it. But even preparing to do this interview, I was gathering trash and starting the dishwasher to get ready to do this interview. Um, and that's part and parcel of life, and that was before I, put my face on and got my clothes together and got all that together, so it was like an hour, a solid hour of prep to get ready to even, do this and have this conversation. And so that's the difficult part, but it's writing is something I do in some form every single day. Really, it's something I do in some form every single day. It is a huge part of my life. It is what I'm best known for, and I'm very privileged. My work is read on every inhabited continent on the planet. I sell books in every Anglophone country, including Canada, Britain, Australia, everywhere, and that's really spectacular. It's endemic of our modern age, that I have that access to people that wasn't a possibility when I started my career in 2007. That wasn't a thing all 15 years ago, but it is now. And so now I can reach people in a way that I never would have been able to before. Oh no, not the MFA question. So I was for a long time against MFA programs. I didn't see the point of them, and I didn't see the point of them for me. I didn't think they had anything to offer. I read a book called The Pocket MFA, and I thought that I was good, and they were kind of like, yeah, you don't really need to do it. Like, we'll tell you everything that you'll learn, and all this type of thing. And I'm like, okay, great, I'll read this book, done and dusted. My reasons for getting an MFA were purely economic. There were more options in terms of jobs and projects and opportunities with a terminal degree in hand. I also wanted the option to teach, and having an MFA enables that. I can actually teach graduates now, because it is a terminal degree in the field. I have a lot of flexibility, and so as someone who is a working full time artist, having options and skills and flexibility and being able to go and do things is important. And in the world we live in, that credential elevated me to a different level. Which means I now have 5 letters after my name and not just 2. But I will say I really struggled And I already had a master's in another field. My undergrad and first graduate degree were in political science. And so this was my second grad school experience, and it was so hard. Um, Everybody seemed to have more passion than me in the program. They had all been English undergrads. I was coming from political science. I had taken maybe two English classes in undergrad, and that was 15 years ago. When I started that program, I hadn't darkened the door of an academic institution in 10 years. So, I was really starting from scratch, from nothing. I'd never written a critical paper before. I had never read for critique before. I didn't have a clue. Um, and so I was fully prepared to wash out the first week. I sat down with the program director and said, I don't know if this is for me. And I really struggled with it. I spoke to my great friend, the great author, Dr. Liz Williams in the UK. Great, great sci fi writer. Please look her up. Um, and she told me that the only way she got through her PhD was through, and I'm quoting now, sheer bloody mindedness. And so I decided that I had to do what I was going to do to finish. And it was perilous till the very end. I didn't believe I was graduating until we were at the ceremony and it was happening. Um, but it was not easy. I love the low residency. I did low residency. That's not sustainable for everyone. It's not cheap. I have, piled on the debt to make this happen. I get it. It's a very difficult thing. I still don't think an MFA is right for everyone. But if you want to do this and you want to make a career out of it, I think it opens up doors to you that would not be open otherwise. And I'll give you an example. I was at a networking event, and the School of Communications for the University of Washington was there, and they were looking for faculty. I literally was able to walk right up and said, hey, I have a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. I have a background in marketing and business. Let's talk. And that was all I needed. It's like, oh, yeah, you have it. Great. Well, let's have a conversation. So that wasn't possible before. And it is now. And like I said, I can teach grad school and all this type of thing. I can teach at that level. And so that's a very different conversation. Very, very different conversation. What is one thing I wish someone had told me about writing? I wish I had known how the industry was changing when I started. I don't think anybody quite knew what was going on at the time with Amazon and the way publishing was changing and all this type of thing. I don't think anybody knew, but I wish someone had known and had told me. The reality is that there are far fewer jobs and opportunities than there used to be. There were people back in the day who their whole lives they wrote short stories for the Saturday Evening Post. They raised their kids, bought a house, and raised their families on that. That doesn't exist anymore at all. It's not a thing. There are great people who wrote in magazines and newspapers, and that was their whole jam. That was the industry that I was prepared for. Was like, oh, you write for these magazines, and then maybe you write something and people want to turn it into a book, or it gets published in parts in a magazine and then gets put together in a book. That was the industry I thought I was walking into. So I came to it as I need to submit to magazines and have great ideas and all this type of thing. I never got anywhere in that. That's one of the reasons I started the Cameron Journal, was so I would have somewhere to write about the ideas that I'd come up with. Um, Mostly because I don't like writing things that aren't going to get read. Um, so if I'm doing something, I like it to have purpose and meaning. And so I didn't like writing an article on spec and then be kind of like, well, nobody bought it, so that's the end of that. Um, I didn't like that, so I started my own online thing to publish the stuff that I was thinking about and that I was writing that no magazines would want and all this type of thing. But the reality is the industry was changing. That was a pathway for people who were established, but for a newcomer, there was never going to be a lot of demand. And then the great financial crisis happened, digital publishing came along, and that just really changed the industry. Um, Now much of the development of writers happens on digital publishing platforms where there isn't any monetization. It takes a long time to get paid to do this. Um, I wish I knew how long it would have taken to get my career off the ground. Um, it's even to this day, it's uncanny when I get in, statements from Ingram, and I see what books have sold, and or I get my payouts from Medium.com or other things. It's always kind of amazing and a surprise because it's like, oh, I'm like getting paid to write. How weird, all this type of thing. And now as a platform, with the Cameron Journal, I have income from being a platform and having an audience and kind of being an influencer, and that didn't exist when I started in 2007. It didn't. There wasn't that didn't exist yet. We didn't have social media yet. We didn't have the smartphone yet. Um, so I wish someone had been able to kind of walk me through that. Um, but I don't think anybody knew or understood it. A lot has happened in a very short period of time. Um, I do definitely wish someone had told me how long it takes to actually write a book. I don't necessarily know that I would have kept going. So maybe it's a good thing no one told me that. Um, but it's a very long time. The best books on writing, not Stephen King's On Writing. Let me just say that from the beginning. I don't like that book. I read it, not a fan. If you want to learn about writing in terms of craft, Putting Fire in Your Fiction by Donald Moss is great. He's a top flight New York agent. I have seen him in person at a writing conference. He is fantastic. For craft, that book can't be beat. Um, as far as ruminating on writing as a thing, I mean, everybody likes the Stephen King book on writing, so I guess go ahead. Um, there's some quippy stuff from Vonnegut. I kind of take a Hemingway sort of view. I don't necessarily know that writing about writing is so great. I mean, I say that ironically. I'm doing this video about writing. I don't necessarily think it's so great. But there's wonderful resources on writing from a craft perspective and from a philosophical perspective. And so I would start with Putting Fire in Your Fiction and kind of explore from there. Let Amazon recommendations be your guide. A good story. There's a lot to a good story. A good story has a nice arc to it. It also has really compelling characters. There's events that happen that change people and either reinforce who they are or change who they are as people. They can learn something about themselves, their friends, their family, their society. There's sort of a shape that keeps you guessing and turning the page and wanting to find out what happens. And part of that is the compellingness of the events, but a lot of it has to do with the investment in the characters. You want to see them fail, you want to see them succeed, you want to see them get to where they're going, you want to see how they're going to handle this tragedy. Um, we want to find out what's next as we've invested in the people, and when we're invested in the people, we want to see what's going to happen with them. One of the things I learned early on was to be more character driven. I prefer to write about settings and situations and context and the why of it all, and people really invest in other people. And that bit of advice completely changed my writing. When I was meeting with an agent and she said, you need to write about people, we need to get invested in your characters, I went home and completely rewrote something I was working on. And I started with the people. And it completely changed the character of my writing. I was very good at telling a story in terms of, then this happened, all she said, all this type of thing, but it wasn't telling a story. I was telling you about what happened. I wasn't telling you what happened. And so it completely changed the way I write. Um, and that's what makes a good story. The best thing to find out about a good story is to go think about what was the last fiction book you read and what did you like about it. Now, this may be a long time ago. For a lot of people, the last thing you read was in high school, and that's okay. But the last good book you read, figure out what was about it that you loved. And that's the special sauce. Not every book is for everybody. Not by far. Some of my favorites, no one wants to read. But that special thing of figuring out what was it about it that got you going and made you get through it, that's what makes a good story. And that's what you should try to bring to your own work. Now, don't be slavishly tied to that. Because it can be a high standard. You don't see all the drafts that came beforehand. You're only looking at the finished product. But keeping that as a lodestone, as a guide star, is a great place to start. What is the power of story? You mean besides my new coaching and course program? Humans live in story. It's how we process reality. We see things that happen and make up a story about them. That's the foundation of religion, mythology. Before the scientific method and all that, all we had was story. And for most people today, we still live in stories. This is especially true in news and politics. We live in news narratives and news stories, and we, um, we, uh, it's less about the facts and more about what it means to us as people and what we think and feel about it. People vote with their wallets, they vote with their hearts, and so we still are in these stories and how things are perceived and how they're talked about and what's said on social media, and that oftentimes has nothing to do with the prima facie facts of it. It has everything to do with the story. And so, um, we have the story of our lives, we have the story of society, we have the story that's going on around us, and the power of story is that it gives us a way of understanding the world. It is a lens, it is a method through which we can understand the world, and that's why great writing defines an age. The Dust Bowl was defined by The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. That work defined that period because the story was so good and so compelling, and it took this huge national problem and condensed it down into something that the average person could read, consume, and understand. Or the person who'd never been to Oklahoma, never been to the Dust Bowl, could read it and be kind of like, I get it now. That's the power of story. And we see that in movies, we see that in television. I think writing is a unique medium because it's so intimate. We get to know characters in books in a way that we don't necessarily do in movies. Somewhat more so in television because television has many episodes over a long period of time and you can really get to know people. But writing has this unique intimacy with characters that is not the same in other mediums. And I think that's really special, and that's the power of story. What is my primary job as a writer? Firstly, to be a student of people. I've learned to people watch. I've learned to understand people, who they are, where they came from, where they're going, wants, needs, desires. Um, I also do a lot of research and get understanding about stuff. I talk to experts, so the journalism reportage of it all is very important. Um, and I try to pass on that understanding to others in a way that they can get. In fiction, that can be about big things. My first novel was about a young man who killed his stepfather with a cast iron frying pan for molesting his sister, and his life afterwards, which included prison, becoming a gay prostitute, getting exposed to HIV, doing a bunch of drugs, going to prison again, and then dating a stripper. Um, and that's a journey a lot of people won't know or understand. And it's very much about the white working class and how the system kind of punishes people for being poor and disadvantaged and all this type of thing. And it is an education in that world that a lot of people will have never ever seen. And so whether it's at the Cameron Journal when I'm talking about politics and public policy and international relations, or if it's in fiction when I'm talking about the plight of the white working class, is to pass on the understanding. I like to write stuff that anyone can get into. I always say, I'm the guy at the end of the bar that's just really smart and knows a lot of stuff and is willing to tell you and talk about it. And I think that's my thing. That's my little shtick, is that I take this stuff that's all very sophisticated and crazy and high-minded, and I try to bring it down to earth so where people can be like, ah, I get it now. And sometimes it doesn't matter where you come to it with it, what your politics are, or what your background is, or all this type of thing, but it's just like, okay, I get it. And sometimes I write a story that's pure fun that just brings people joy. I have this one story in my short story collection called The Ticket. It's about a man who has won $50,000 in a lottery, but it's his last day to collect the money. And he has a terrible time getting from Seattle to Olympia to collect it. And people really enjoy that story just because it's so kind of compelling. And you want him to win. You want him to get the money. You want him to get there on time. And he meets a woman along the way. And it's all very fascinating. And so, so bringing that to people is also great as well. So I think, that's my job. I have to be a student of people. I need to do research and get understanding and bring it to people in an accessible way. And every once in a while, just do something for fun.